Hello and welcome to The Complete History of Science. Series 7, Episode 6. Let me not seem to have lived in vain. As Johannes Kepler approached Benátky Castle in February 1600, he felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. His host, Tycho Brahe, had invited him to discuss a possible working arrangement, and Kepler urgently needed the visit to go well. As a Protestant in Graz, he was facing increasing persecution by the Counter-Reformation, and he knew he would soon need to leave permanently. To work with Tycho would be an escape and an opportunity. Tycho was the most famous and accomplished astronomer in Europe. 30 years earlier, he had arrived on Hven, a tiny Danish island of simple farmsteads, and transformed it into a state-of-the-art observatory, equipped with the most advanced astronomical instruments of the period. For decades, Tycho and his team of assistants observed the night sky, collecting the most precise set of astronomical data ever recorded. Kepler, by contrast, had never made any serious astronomical observations in his life. He did, however, understand as well as anyone the value of Tycho's work. Kepler had written Mysterium Cosmographicum, a book of speculations about the cosmos. In particular, Kepler was a Copernican who, unlike most of his contemporaries, believed in the literal truth of a moving Earth. His ultimate goal was to demonstrate heliocentrism. Mysterium had made little progress towards this goal. Kepler was hindered by his lack of astronomical data. Working with Tycho, then, offered Kepler the possibility to develop his theories more fully. Naturally, Tycho also had his own motivations for wanting to meet Kepler. For the past decade, he had been trying to publish definitive proof of his own astronomical system. Tycho's geoheliocentric system had the planets orbiting the Sun, while the Sun orbited a stationary Earth. He believed that this model fixed the remaining problems in astronomy by keeping the benefits of Copernicanism without the supposed absurdity of a moving Earth. Since at least 1590, Tycho was working on a book, Opus Astronomicum, which would include a complete theory of astronomy. He hoped it would be the new Almagest. The issue was that even with his enormous body of data, it was difficult to demonstrate that his system was superior to the Copernican or Ptolemaic models. A huge amount of number crunching would be necessary to find the evidence to support his theory. Tycho was a decent mathematician, but not a great one. He often relied on talented younger men to do the calculations, and Kepler fit the mould perfectly. On arrival at the castle gates, Tycho welcomed Kepler personally. To Kepler, Tycho must have been an imposing figure. He was tall, barrel-chested, and carried himself with the authority of a great noble, which of course he was. Tycho was also enigmatic. A great bronze prosthetic nose adorned his face, the legacy of a youthful duel. And, in Benátky, he lived as an exile, having left Denmark under some dark cloud. In truth, the circumstances of Tycho's exile were not so mysterious. The old Danish King Friedrich had been the great patron of Tycho Brahe, providing the funds to run his island observatory. But when Friedrich died, Tycho found himself out of favour. The new king, Christian, disliked Tycho's presumptuousness. Tycho lived as a lord on Hven, while also spending lavishly on instruments and his own printing press. Christian, keen to rein in expenses, withdrew Tycho's funding and forced him to seek patronage elsewhere. Few other rulers in Europe would be able to provide the funds to run a project on the scale of Hven. To continue his mission, Tycho ingratiated himself with with the most powerful monarch in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II. Rudolf gave Tycho a castle as well as promises of money. So, as Kepler arrived at Benátky in the winter of 1600, Tycho was still settling in. The initial meeting between the two men went well. Tycho told Kepler that he was not only welcome but anticipated. He provided Kepler a room and offered to pay for his travel expenses. Kepler relaxed and hoped that he and Tycho would soon begin working on astronomy. Unfortunately, Tycho was in the middle of a busy period. The Emperor Rudolf had seen images of Ven and was determined to outdo it. He gave Tycho a large allowance to transform Benátky into an observatory. From the hilltop castle, there was a clear view of the surroundings, but there was no obvious place to take observations. Throughout the winter, builders and craftsmen were working tirelessly, changing the structure to accommodate Tycho's instruments. This was exciting, but Kepler was disturbed by the noise. In addition to the construction, the castle hosted Tycho's large family, domestic staff, and astronomical assistants. Kepler was used to the quiet life of a scholar, and the busy castle was outside his comfort zone. Tycho tried to put him at ease. He reassured Kepler they would soon work together and promised that he would find Kepler a role in the household. It would require more money from the emperor, but Tycho was confident he could get it. In the following weeks, though, Kepler continued to feel isolated. At meal times, he was left out of conversations as the Brahes and their assistants spoke Danish. Kepler disliked that everyone drank so much. When he tried to engage Tycho in conversations about astronomy, Kepler found him evasive. In Kepler's mind, he had come as a collaborator and was expecting stimulating discussion. But he found that Tycho only engaged under pressure. When they did talk, Kepler complained that Tycho only let go of snippets of information. The reason was that Tycho was paranoid. He had been in a long-running feud with another astronomer, Nicholas Reimers Barr, a man known as Ursus. In the 1580s, Ursus was a guest of Tycho on Ven, but the pair had fallen out when Ursus was caught going through Tycho's documents. After he left, Ursus began popping up at courts and universities across the continent, claiming to have invented a new model of the solar system. Suspiciously similar to Tycho's geoheliocentric system, Ursus published his version in a book called Astronomical Foundations. To a careful observer, it was clear the idea was Tycho's, but not everyone was paying close attention. In 1591, Ursus appeared at the court of Rudolf II and managed to ingratiate himself, becoming the imperial mathematician. Since that time, Tycho had been incredibly careful sharing data or ideas. He took time to warm to outsiders, only trusting a small group of assistants. At Benátky, the two most important were Franz Tengnagel and Longomontanus. Tengnagel was a Dutch nobleman who had joined Tycho in 1595. A talented diplomat, Tengnagel had mixed at courts across Europe during Tycho's exile. He had been instrumental in the search for a new patron and had made the initial approach to the Holy Roman Emperor. Tycho was grateful, and Tengnagel's place within the family was assured when he became engaged to Tycho's daughter. Tengnagel, though, was not much of an astronomer, and so much of the heavy work was left to Longomontanus. Born Christian Sorensen, Longomontanus was from a poor peasant family, but had become under Tycho an accomplished astronomer. He had been with Tycho since around 1590, becoming a close friend of the family and Tycho's personal secretary. Tycho regarded Longomontanus highly and trusted him completely with observations. During the 1590s, he had managed the tedious but crucial task of collecting data for the star catalogue. Now at Benátky, he was working closely with Tycho to analyse their observations and gather evidence for the geoheliocentric system. Kepler fit awkwardly into this picture. The other assistants had demonstrated their value and loyalty, while Kepler was an unknown entity. What's more, Kepler knew he would never be an observational astronomer on par with the others. Through his life, Kepler was not in good physical health. His eyesight was poor, and he was forced to excuse himself from observations. This meant that Kepler was left out, while Tycho and his long-standing assistants made their nightly measurements. Keen to find a place within this hierarchy, Kepler pleaded with Tycho to allow him to work with his data. Tycho was still not comfortable sharing too much, but at the same time, he and Longomontanus had run into a problem. They were analysing observations of Mars and trying to plot the planet's orbit, but their predictions for Mars's position were always out. So, Tycho invited Kepler to begin to work on the problem under the watchful eye of Longomontanus. Kepler was thrilled by the opportunity and made some quick progress. He realised that the only way to make sense of the data was to relate Mars's position to the true position of the Sun. For the geocentrists, the position of the Sun was irrelevant for calculating the positions of the planets. According to them, everything moved around the Earth independently. For Kepler, however, the planets orbited the Sun, so knowing the position of the Sun was crucial for calculating the position of the planets. This was a particularly important issue to deal with, as prior astronomers had not tracked the true position of the Sun. Instead, they had used another entirely fictitious point, called the mean Sun. The reasons for this date back to the 2nd century BC, when Hipparchus realised the Sun doesn't travel at a constant speed throughout the year. At some points, it seems to travel faster, and at others, it travels slower. This was unfortunate, as the Sun is also a useful timekeeping device. The calendar year, for example, is based on the idea that the Sun moves around the Earth at a constant rate. To get around this, the mean Sun was introduced. The mean Sun is a fictional point which really does move uniformly around the Earth. Having a mean Sun enter into the calculation was a useful reference for all other phenomena. Essentially, Hipparchus pretended that the Sun went around the Earth at a steady rate, and this acted like a giant celestial clock. For the geocentrists, this worked well, and so for almost 2,000 years, astronomers used this device. The problem was that this tool also introduced an error into the calculations that Kepler was the first to appreciate. The mean Sun was very close to the true Sun, but there was usually some small difference. If the planets then were referenced to the mean Sun, their positions would often be slightly wrong. This choice reflected Kepler's conviction that it was the Sun that caused the planets to move in their orbits. The fact that this choice also improved the accuracy of the predicted positions of the planets only bolstered his belief. Tycho was impressed and agreed with Kepler that this was the right approach. The idea had already occurred to him. The planets, after all, were orbiting the Sun in his geoheliocentric system. But Tycho was also concerned. Kepler was clearly a brilliant theorist. The question was, which theory was he interested in? Tycho worried that Kepler was pursuing heliocentrism. The tension between the two men continued to mount. Several months had passed, and Kepler still had no formal position. He was growing increasingly anxious about the situation. The issue was that Kepler wasn't like Tycho's usual assistants. Typically, they were young men who put up with the hardship of living on Ven in exchange for working with Tycho. Kepler, though, was older, married, and had a stepdaughter. He desperately needed a paying job. In Graz, the Counter-Reformation had made life unbearable for Protestants, but without guarantee of employment, it was difficult to drag his wife away from her home. Tycho, on the other hand, saw Kepler's desire to push for a contract as a lack of trust. He had been working hard to secure Kepler employment. The difficulty was he had received no money from the emperor. Kepler got tired of waiting. He demanded a meeting with Tycho where he laid out the terms of his future employment. He wanted permission to go to Prague whenever he chose. He wanted a separate house for his own family, and he wanted guaranteed time off on Sundays and holidays. Tycho agreed to these conditions, but had also decided he would use the negotiation to extract something he wanted in return from Kepler. This was an opinion on Ursus. Tycho had replaced Ursus as imperial mathematician in a clash which had become ugly and personal. During the struggle over the position, Ursus published a book called Astronomical Hypotheses, which, despite the name, was primarily an attack on Tycho. He accused Tycho of treachery and plagiarism, mocked Tycho's false nose, made insinuations about Tycho's partner and daughter, and implied that Tycho had been forced to leave Denmark because of some terrible crime. In response, Tycho vowed revenge. He had replaced Ursus as imperial mathematician, but this wasn't enough. Tycho wanted to destroy Ursus's reputation. Ursus's publication had drawn Kepler into the row. Kepler had called Ursus my teacher and the Prince of Mathematicians. Tycho had read this introduction with interest, but rather than turning to anger, he sensed an opportunity. If Kepler were to retract his letter and publicly come to Tycho's side, it would undermine Ursus. Tycho demanded from Kepler a detailed account of the affair, ostensibly to use in a lawsuit. Kepler wasn't against the idea of writing in support of Tycho, but used the promise of a letter as leverage in their negotiations. He continued to demand a salary from Tycho, and money became the sticking point. Tycho explained he had received none of the cash promised from the emperor, but Kepler didn't accept. Later over dinner, Kepler got drunk and launched into an angry outburst. The next day, he left for Prague. Kepler stayed with Baron Hoffmann, the friend who had made the initial introduction to Tycho. Quickly, Kepler came to his senses and began to feel regretful. An effusive apology was dispatched to Tycho, who surprisingly, without hesitation, forgave him. Tycho even came to Prague personally to bring Kepler back. Both men realized their circumstances had not changed. They needed each other, and they would have to reach a compromise. A new plan was laid out. Tycho would write to the emperor, and instead of asking for money, he would extract a note, asking for Kepler to continue to receive his salary from Graz. In the meantime, Tycho would continue to lobby and find an additional stipend for Kepler. This satisfied Kepler. He planned a return to Graz to arrange his family's move to Benátky. In the days before he left, the relationship between the two men began to warm again, and they spoke of a scientific problem. In March 1598, Tycho observed a solar eclipse using a pinhole camera. A pinhole camera is a simple device with a narrow hole which projects an image onto a screen. Tycho, observing the eclipse, measured the image of the moon as it moved across the sun. However, he concluded from his measurement that the moon was not large enough to completely cover the sun. The result made no sense. Astronomers had known for centuries that solar eclipses were possible. They had been observed many times. Before he left, Tycho showed Kepler how to build a pinhole device for himself. Arriving in Graz in early June, Kepler was optimistic. He believed his financial problems had been solved, and he now had a juicy scientific problem to get his teeth into. In early July, there was due to be a partial solar eclipse, and Kepler built a pinhole camera, ready to observe it. Measuring the radius of the moon relative to the sun, he realized that Tycho was correct. The moon seemed to be too small to cover the sun. Over the following days, he thought deeply about the problem. History had demonstrated that total solar eclipses were possible, so Kepler came to the only logical conclusion: the pinhole must be distorting the image. He set out to investigate. His understanding of optics was based on Alhaitham, who had demonstrated that every point on an object emits light in straight lines in all directions. Another way to picture this is that light rays move out from a point in a cone. Applying this idea, Kepler realized that the problem came from the pinhole itself. The pinhole forms an image by selecting a very narrow portion of this light cone. Although the pinhole is small, it still has some finite width. So, after the light passes through the pinhole, it spreads out a little before it reaches the screen, causing the image to blur. This blurring means that images of the sun and moon don't reflect their true proportions. The sun's disk leaks into the shadow of the moon, and so appears not to cover it. Kepler concluded that whenever light passes through a pinhole, it no longer gives a good measurement of the angular size. His investigation into the pinhole camera stimulated Kepler to reach a broader realization. All astronomical observations depend on a proper understanding of visual theory. He carried this thought around with him for the next several years. Unfortunately, Kepler would have no time to work on this problem further, as his life was once again thrown into turmoil. His request to continue to receive his salary was denied. The council said there was no useful reason for him to continue to be in Prague. This put an end to his plan to return to Benátky. Without a salary, there was no deal with Tycho. And worse news was to come. He received a letter demanding that, at the end of the month, he was to present himself to authorities for examination of his faith. Kepler had dreaded this moment since the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. He knew what it was likely to mean. On August 3rd, in front of the Archduke, Kepler presented himself at church. For the past 3 days, thousands of citizens of Graz had passed through to submit themselves for examination. They were asked to profess their faith, and non-Catholics were ordered to convert. Many chose to comply to save themselves. Kepler, however, refused. Punishment for refusal was banishment. He and 61 other citizens were given 6 weeks to get their affairs in order. On the 30th of September 1600, Kepler, along with his wife Barbara and stepdaughter Regina, loaded what they could carry onto a carriage and left Graz for good. The cost for Kepler was huge. He lost his job as well as his wife's substantial property. But the Lutheran faith formed Kepler's whole identity. He was a man of remarkable conviction who would not allow himself to be bullied. His wife Barbara was equally headstrong and gladly stood by his side. He wrote, "I would not have thought it so sweet to suffer injury and indignity for the sake of religion, to abandon house, fields, friends, and homeland. If this is the way of real martyrdom, it is an easy matter to die for faith. On his journey, Kepler received a letter from Tycho. At the emperor's personal request, Tycho had moved to Prague and suggested that Kepler join him. He insisted that the failure to ensure a salary did not matter and that he should return with confidence as rapidly as possible. Kepler was not keen on the idea of returning. In Prague, he knew he would be relying entirely on Tycho's goodwill. But, out of options, Kepler arrived in October of 1600. He said, "God let me be bound with Tycho through an unalterable fate, and did not let me be separated from him." Kepler became ill on arriving back in Prague. He had a cough and worried he might have contracted tuberculosis. Before meeting Tycho, he took several weeks to recover with Baron Hoffmann. Tycho tried to reassure Kepler that things would be different to last time. He was still working to get Kepler a salary, but in the meantime began to pay Kepler from his own pocket. In February 1601, Kepler and his family moved in with the Brahes. Despite the salary and Tycho's promises, Kepler found the relationship just as challenging as before. Tycho was distrustful and only showed Kepler a limited number of observations. Kepler in turn grew resentful. He compared Tycho to a dragon sitting on a hoard of gold that he couldn't use but was unwilling to share. Even worse, Tycho would insist that Kepler spend his time writing against Ursus. Although Ursus had actually died the previous summer, Tycho refused to relent. Even while Ursus was on his deathbed, Tycho had hounded him with lawyers. Now, after his death, Tycho was hunting down copies of Ursus's book to be burnt. Despite the fact he had clearly won, Tycho saw Ursus as a threat to his reputation. Tycho wanted to ensure that he would get sole credit for the geoheliocentric system, and believed a letter from Kepler would help cement his legacy. Kepler hated this task. He found it distasteful to attack Ursus after his death. Again, though, out of options, he began to write. The treatise reflects well on Kepler. He minimized personal attacks on Ursus and reported the affair objectively. Making the most of the situation, Kepler also included a perceptive observation on the difference between Copernican and Ptolemaic systems. According to Kepler, the Ptolemaic system wasn't wrong, but it did miss the point. Ptolemy could make good predictions for the planet's motion, but couldn't explain the cause of that motion. By contrast, Copernicus offered natural explanations for physical phenomena like retrograde motion. Still, Kepler dragged his feet, and the work was never finished. These were difficult months for Kepler. He was still ill, and his wife had difficulty settling in Prague. She complained she wasn't given enough to cover their expenses. Kepler brought up the matter with Tycho, who promised to help, though he was having money problems himself. As well as paying Kepler's salary, he was busy preparing for his daughter's wedding. In response to these difficulties, Tycho formed a plan. During Kepler's absence in Graz, Tycho had become close to Rudolf. His summons back to Prague was mainly to better advise the emperor. A huge number of decisions needed to be made, and the emperor wanted the opinion of his chief astrologer. Rudolf expected detailed predictions about military campaigns and other businesses of state, which Tycho was uncomfortable with. But, as Tycho was wholly reliant on Rudolf's money, he complied. Around the autumn of 1600, Rudolf withdrew from public life. There were many stresses in his life, including the Counter-Reformation and a long war with the Ottomans, which led Rudolf to have a mental breakdown. During his unwellness, Tycho remained one of the emperor's closest advisors, even as many others fell afoul of his moods. Tycho enjoyed a new level of prestige and began to regularly receive his salary. In gratitude for his service, Rudolf gave Tycho citizenship and legitimized his children, who could now inherit Tycho's property. However, Tycho decided to ask for something more. He took Kepler to meet Rudolf for the first time. Tycho offered to produce for the emperor a new set of planetary tables of unprecedented accuracy. These tables would replace the Alphonsine tables which had been created in the 13th century for Alfonso X of Castile. Tycho told Rudolf that the new set of tables would surpass the old ones in every way and create a great legacy for Rudolf. Delighted, Rudolf promised a salary for Kepler directly from his own funds. Kepler was doubly thrilled. He would not only now have a substantial salary, but there was also no way that Tycho could construct the tables without sharing his data. Finally, Kepler thought he might get to work on his theories. A few days after the meeting with the emperor, Tycho met a friend, Councillor Minkiewicz. Since arriving in Prague, Tycho had maintained a busy social life, mixing in intellectual circles. Over dinner, he drank a generous amount of wine, but because of etiquette, refused to excuse himself from the table until his host had stood up. During dinner, he felt a problem with his bladder, and on returning home, found he was unable to urinate. Tycho was confined to his bed. Days passed, and Tycho's sleepless agony became delirium. Kepler sat with Tycho throughout his suffering. In one of his moments of lucidity, Tycho asked Kepler to continue his work. He understood that he was dying, so clung to the hope that Kepler might continue to develop the geoheliocentric system. In his final days, he was said to repeat over and over again, "Let me not seem to have lived in vain." On the 24th of October, 1601, Tycho Brahe died. He was given a magnificent funeral in Prague and buried in the church. The streets were full of mourners. His casket was draped in black and decorated in gold. 12 imperial officials carried the casket, followed by Tycho's family and other nobles. When the sermon was read, banners, helmets, shields and arms were hung over the crypt as Tycho was lowered down to his final resting place. Kepler didn't walk with the main procession. Instead, he sat alone. While the relationship had always been difficult, Tycho was his loyal patron and guardian. Uncertainty weighed heavily on Kepler during Tycho's final days, and now he'd been set adrift. If Kepler was worried, though, he needn't have been. 2 days after the funeral, he was visited by the emperor's secretary. Kepler was to be made the new imperial mathematician. He was given responsibility for the production of the astronomical tables, and most precious of all, he was to be given charge of all of Tycho's observations. Kepler realized that his real work could now begin. Thank you to everyone who supported the show recently. If you'd like to contribute, there's a link in the show description. Otherwise, please just rate us 5-star on your podcast app. It means a lot to me when people do. The next episode will be with you very shortly. Until next time,